short video clip from the ABC television show Good Morning America, and this was kind of the reason that we got Ms. Montague here, because it came out about a month and a half, 2 months ago or so, after the movie Hidden Figures, and Rory put it in the clips, and some of us watched it and said, that's who we ought to have come speak to us.
She broke barriers just like the women in the movie and transformed the design process for all Navy ships. We're going to have the honor of speaking to her in just a moment, but first I want everybody to know your remarkable story.
What do you guys do for NASA?
Calculate your launch and landing site.
The Oscar-nominated film Hidden Figures celebrates the true story of 3 African-American women who helped propel the U.S. space program to new heights: Mary Jackson, Dorothy Vaughan, and Katherine Johnson.
I analyzed the manometer levels for air displacement, friction, and velocity.
As they were breaking barriers at NASA, another hidden figure, Raye Montague, was making history at the Navy.
I am known as the first person to design a ship using a computer. And I was the first female program manager of ships in the history of the Navy, which was the equivalent of being the CEO of a company.
The Little Rock native was a child of the segregated South and never saw an engineer who looked like her.
My mother told me when I was a very little girl, Raye, you'll have 3 strikes against you. You're female and you're black, and you'll have a Southern segregated school education. But you can be or do anything you want, provided you're educated.
She would go on to receive a Bachelor of Science in Business, and in 1956, she moved to Washington, D.C. to begin her career with the Navy.
And they said, oh, you've got a Bachelor of Science. You're on the leading edge of technology. I didn't know that.
Over the next 14 years, she would shatter glass ceilings as a woman in a male-dominated field, surpassing those who would have held her back and maneuvering around every roadblock thrown in her path.
To think back to what she dealt with back then, especially with the gender variable as well, they thought that she was supposed to be getting them coffee, and then she was the one actually there in charge.
Today, 82-year-old Raye Montague is credited with revolutionizing the design process for all naval ships and submarines.
She had to keep proving herself over and over that she could do the job. But she took that with a smile too. And she was able to rise above those type of things.
Please welcome Mrs. Raye Montague.
Well, what an introduction. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Ms. Tiara Robinson, the Women's ERG lead, and Mrs. Raye Montague.
Good morning.
Good morning.
First, I need to get someone that's going to cue me on the time because we met yesterday and we talked a long time.
Yes.
And we both keep talking. So if I can just get, let me know when I got 5 minutes. Right. Okay. First, I want to thank you for joining us today. It's an honor to have you here. We are very excited to have you here. Okay?
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be back here.
Yes, thank you. So yesterday morning, your son, he sent me a very interesting email. from the train, your train ride here. And he mentioned how next month marks the 61st anniversary of when you first left home to come start your career here in DC. He mentioned that this train ride brought back many memories of when you first traveled here. Please share some of those memories with us. What was going through your mind as you crossed the states from Little Rock, Arkansas to Washington?
I'll be honest with you. On that train, I left home in Little Rock, Arkansas, the day after I graduated college. And I got on the train coming to DC because I had decided to become an engineer when I was 7 years old. And I thought the best place to go would be Washington. And I didn't have a job. So, so when I got here and found my resume around, and the Navy was the first group to call me in for an interview. And of course, as you saw in the film clip, they said I was on the leading edge of technology. I didn't know it. But coming here on the train, I thought about all the things that I hoped would happen, but I didn't have any idea about the computers and that type of thing because I'd never seen a computer. Remember, this is 1956. It's before your parents were born in most cases. And the attitude of people was that was so far-fetched. And I'm thinking, what am I going to do? What am I going to be placed when I get there? And then I thought about all the things that happened through the years to me. And here, 61 years later, I'm on a train for the first time since 1956, coming back to the Navy. And I was thinking about all the things that have passed through when I made that first train trip to DC. And between that and this current trip, how much has happened to me and to the world. And the fact that I'm still fighting for my country because some of the ships that I worked on are still in the fleet. And you stop and think about that. And can you imagine I'm riding along and saying, yep, those were interesting days. They were hard days at times. But just look at it. I love my country. And I'm still fighting for my country.
All right. Thank you for that. So give us a little insight into the early days in Little Rock. Why did your grandfather go and take you to see that German submarine? And do you think it was was to intentionally spark an interest in you, or was it just something that just happened?
Well, this was World War II, and I'm 7 years old. And they captured a German mini submarine off of the coast of the Carolinas, and they brought it on tour to Little Rock, Arkansas. My grandfather had other grandchildren, but he only took me down to see the submarine. Why? I don't know. But they let me go up the little ladder and down the hatch, and I saw the dials and mechanisms, and I looked through the periscope, and I turned to the guy who was giving the spiel, and I said, what do you have to know to do this? He said, oh, you'd have to be an engineer, but you don't ever have to worry about that. Remember, I'm 7 years old. And I said, you say I have to be an engineer? I didn't know what an engineer was. And he said, yes, but like I said, you don't ever have to worry about that. Well, I didn't realize that I had been insulted. And I asked my mother to take me to find out what was required to become an engineer. And she did. And they said all the math, science, and thinking outside of the box. So I pursued that. My grandfather died just 2 years after he took me down to see that sub. He never explained why he took me. But I kept saying to him, I want to design or do that type of work. Remember, my mother had told me that I would have 3 strikes against me. But she told me that before my grandfather took me down to see the sub. That I was black, I was female, and would have a Southern segregated school education. But that I could do anything I wanted to do, provided I was educated. And the main thing is she stressed to me, there's no such thing as women's work or men's work. And I took that for granted. I believed it, and it never entered my mind that I couldn't become an engineer because that was considered a man's work. To me, my mother said I could do anything if I was educated. And education didn't just start in my family with affirmative action. If you think of the short time when slavery ended, 1865, my grandmother's brother graduated college in 1902. And then he graduated medical school in 1910. My mother graduated college in 1927, and I graduated in 1956. So I'm third generation college educated. And like my mother told me, I could do anything provided I was educated. So it was drilled in me that you must be educated. Take advantage of all of this.
Now, do you think the German submarine visit was more impactful in your life because your grandfather had taken you? Like, do you think that when fathers and grandfathers, men, support women in male-dominated fields, the results are more prominent?
Well, I'll be honest with you. I appreciated the fact that my grandfather took me down to see the sub because my father was not active in my life. My parents were divorced when I was 4 years old, so my mother was the wind beneath my wings. She made everything possible for me. But I think my grandfather was trying to reinforce what she was doing. And as I said before, he died shortly afterwards. But it was a strong point that he believed that I could do anything. And apparently he saw something in me that was different from his other grandchildren. And, here we go.
All right.
And so if you have children, you men, if you have children and grandchildren, get involved with them and let them know that there's no such thing as men's work and women's work. I didn't like to play with dolls. My mother bought dolls for me as a child, and she called them her grandchildren because I wanted to play with trucks and other mechanical things. But that was me, okay? So get your kids involved, regardless of their sex, and don't try to point them in a certain direction. We all have many talents. We all have many talents, but finding the right fit for us is something that we have to be allowed to do and encouraged to do.
So from what I've learned about you from your bios and interviews, is that it seems to me that you've had this spark in from very, very young age. And even in the face of adversity, you remained strong and focused on achievement. I know you mentioned your mother. Is there any person, I'm assuming it might be your mom, but if there's any person in your life who had instilled that in you from an early age, would you care to share? And throughout life?
Okay. Remember, I said I decided to become an engineer when I was 7. And going to elementary school and junior high school, 8th grade, kids started to talk about what they wanted to be when they grew up. And when they heard me say that I wanted to become an engineer, they all laughed at me because they thought I wanted to drive a train. Well, that's what they had seen. They didn't know and had not been exposed to the broader side of engineering that I had been exposed to because of my grandfather and taken all the special classes. Well, one of the teachers, Mrs. Irma Holliday, heard them teasing me. And she called me aside and she said, "Ray, don't get upset about them teasing you. Aim for the stars. At the very worst, you'll land on the moon." And if I have time, I'll tell you a little more about that. But I took that in consideration. And I continued to take all the math and science. And my mother had to come up and do battle with the school system because in Arkansas, females were required to take 4 years of home economics. I couldn't care less about home ec. I wanted to take shop. And the rules were girls couldn't take shop classes. So my mother came up and she did battle. And she convinced the principal that if I could pass the exams in home economics without attending class, I could take shop. Well, what they didn't realize was that I had a photographic memory. And I could read. And I remembered. So I aced the home ec classes in that sense. And I took shop. And so this was a strong point that really got me going. Well, then when I graduated high school, I wanted to go to engineering school. But the only school in the state of Arkansas that offered a degree in engineering was the University of Arkansas at Fayetteville, and they did not accept minorities. So that's why I had to attend an HBCU, this historical black college university, and received a Bachelor of Science in Business. But I still wanted to become an engineer. So that's why the day after graduation, I got on the train and came to DC.
So moving forward to your days in DC, was it still the German submarine that ignited that spark from when you were 7 years old that drove you to apply for positions within the Navy?
I fanned my resume out over many agencies, and it was ironic that the Navy was the first group to call me in for an interview. And they offered me a position at the David Taylor Model Basin in Colorado. And I was working with guys who had graduated from Harvard and Yale with degrees in engineering, and people who had worked on the Manhattan Project developing the atom bomb. And again, this is where having this special memory, I could hold 2 conversations and listen to a third. And I could learn while listening. I sent myself to computer programming school, because at that time the Navy didn't send me. But let me tell you how I really started creating every job, and I created every job I ever had after they brought me in. With a college degree, They brought me in as a GS3 clerk typist. Never typed a letter. But each morning, I would go out. My job was to go out on the Univac 1, serial number 2, which is now in the Smithsonian. It was a 1,000-word mercury tank tube memory with vacuum tubes. Right? And the console looked like the cockpit of an airplane, all the switches and dials. Well, my job was to go out and compare metallic tape on which data had been typed to see about the errors in it. Well, I'd have to go out and tell this engineer what I wanted to do. And after 2 weeks, I said to him, his name was John McKendra. I said, John, teach me to operate the computer. And he said, no, if I teach you to operate the computer, you'd have my job. And I said, okay. So for another couple of weeks, I would go out in the morning, mount my little tapes, tell him what I wanted to do, and I'd watch him do his little stuff. And at the end of that second 2 weeks, for some reason, all the engineers called in sick. And I'm the first person on the computer in the morning. So I walk in and I mount my little tapes, and I stood there and waited, and nobody came in there to operate for me. So I walked over to the console, and slowly but surely, I started to flip the switches and do my type-ins. And the tapes took off. I have good peripheral vision, as most of you have. And I could see coworkers peeping around the corner at me. Because you weren't allowed to touch that, at that time, $1 million piece of equipment unless you were an engineer. And I could see them looking. Because, see, they knew I was from Arkansas, and they didn't think we wore shoes in Arkansas. Well, somebody went back and told my boss. And he came out, and I could see him standing over to the side, looking at me. And finally, he walked over and he said, Ray, I didn't know you knew how to operate the computer. I said, I don't. He said, well, what are you doing? I said, well, I know how to do enough to get my job done. He said, fine, you know more than any of the rest of us here. So from now on, this is your job. So I created every job I had after that. And then it was my job to, thank you, to teach the other civilians to operate the computer. And then I noticed that the guys that I was teaching all of a sudden started being promoted. And they were earning more money than I. So I went to management and I said, why are they earning more money? And I taught them. They said, oh, they have a car and they can come in at night. Carter Rock, Maryland, you didn't have bus transportation out there. And they said, you don't have a car. I said, oh, okay, but if I had a car and could come in at night, I could be promoted? I said, yes. So I went out that evening to a used car lot, and I bought a '49 Pontiac for $375. And I had the salesman to drive it to my house. I went to work the next day, and I volunteered to work midnight shift for a month. And so, you got a car? I said, yeah. Okay. Well, I'd leave home at 10 o'clock at night and drive no mile an hour across D.C. to Carter Rock, Maryland. And I get there and go, phew. And I work all night. And then the next morning, people thought I was being so helpful because I would stay there when the day shift came and I'd help them to hang their tapes and joke around with them. We'd laugh and talk until about 9:30. I was waiting for the traffic to clear up. They didn't know that.
Smart. Very smart.
And I'd get back in my car and I'd go no mile an hour back to my house. And I was worn out, okay? But shortly after that, one of my aunts died in Little Rock, and my mother called and asked if I could come home. And I said yes. So we didn't have a car when I was growing up. But in the short time that I was away from home, my mother had managed to get a car. So one of her friends saw me driving her car when I went home for the funeral. And he worked at the courthouse. And he said, Ray, I see you driving your mother's car. Do you have a driver's license? I said, no. He said, do you want one? I said, yeah. About 2 hours later, he came and tossed my driver's license over to me. I came back to D.C. because you didn't have to have a photo or anything then. And Department of Motor Vehicles in D.C. honored my Arkansas driver's license. So I go to work, and everybody's laughing because I'm busy showing around. I'm real proud of my driver's license. And my boss comes out, and he says, what's so funny? I said, I'm showing them my driver's permit. He said, obviously you had one all the time. I said, no. He said, you did have a learner's permit. I said, no. He said, you mean you've been coming in here on this military base and you didn't have a driver's permit? Yeah. He said, well, why didn't you have a permit? I said, because I didn't know how to drive. And he said, who taught you how to drive? I said, I taught myself coming in here at midnight. Needless to say, I was promoted. So I was fighting for equal pay back then because my attitude was there's no such thing as women's work and men's work, so there shouldn't be a difference in the pay. And so I was fighting for pay.
All right.
And I had to do that for my whole career. You know, you fight like the devil. And my mother used to say, kick like the devil and holler for help.